Flashing, that means you're not close enough to the mic. If it's steady red, you're good.
And it used to be that you could turn the mics off, but I don't think you can do that anymore. So,
These do.
All right, good evening and welcome to the Policy and Planning Commission meeting tonight, May 23rd, 2019. This evening we will be discussing amendments to the Shoreline Master Program, IMC 18.10.940. And then we'll be opening up to public comment, not content. And we will not be closing the hearing tonight or the public comments. We'll be continuing them on to June 13th. And we have our guest speakers this evening. We have Maria Sander Cook. Did I get that right? It's Maria Sander Cook. She's with the Department of Ecology, and she's going to help us answer some questions. And then our guest speaker tonight is also Doug Yormick, and he's one of our assistant planners, and he works with Lucy. All right, and so let's start with the minutes from May 9th, 2019. And do I have a motion to approve the minutes of May 9th?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes from May 9th Planning Policy Commission meeting.
All right, thanks, Bill. And do we have a second?
Second.
All right, thank you, Robin. So we got a second from Robin, and all in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Abstain? Okay, motion carries. Minutes are approved. And now we'll go ahead and open the floor up to Doug. Thank you, Doug.
Good evening. So I'm Doug Yormick. I am not really new with the city, but I have never really done this, at least with PPC. And yeah, and I thought council chambers was Eagle Room. So it shows you how much I actually come to this part of town. I'm usually over in the City Hall Northwest. So anyways, I'm Doug Yormick, Assistant Planner with Development Services. And I'm here to present to you the 2019 Shoreline Master Program update. So were any of you on the board in 2013 during the last update?
no.
No.
No one. Okay. I'm going to give you a quick crash course in what the Shoreline Master Program is. So the Shoreline Master Program are the development regulations for the shoreline jurisdiction of the city. And the shoreline jurisdiction is defined as 200 feet upland of shorelines of the state. Shorelines of the state are defined as streams with mean annual flow of 20 cubic feet per second or greater, lakes greater than 20 acres, all marine waters, which we don't have to worry about, and then associated wetlands, which are wetlands that have some sort of hydraulic continuity with the shoreline of the state. And then for the city of Issaquah, that just means Issaquah Creek, East Fork of Issaquah Creek, and Lake Sammamish. Here is a general idea of where our shoreline jurisdiction lies. So kind of bisecting the city into two. And the different colors are shoreline environmental designations, which is, think of it kind of like zoning. They have their own uses that are allowed and their whole separate permitting for that as well. So since 2013, the city has been pretty busy, and here's just a general timeline of some major events that have happened since that we need to incorporate into our Shoreline Master Program. So shortly after, or almost immediately after we adopted our Shoreline Master Program, Central Issaquah Sub-Area Plan was adopted. That's important because in the Shoreline Master Program, it still references the old zoning for the shoreline designations that go through Central Issaquah. In 2015, the city annexed Lake Sammamish State Park. So that kind of needs to be incorporated into that as well. And then in 2017, Washington legislature adopted a rule for periodic review that now puts every municipality on an 8-year schedule, and ours happens to be up in 2019. So the purpose of the periodic update, just like we've been busy updating codes, annexing areas, the state and ecology have also been busy, and they've had numerous rule changes since 2013. So they have prepared a checklist based on that, and we have performed a gap analysis to see which rules we need to incorporate into our Shoreline Master Program. We also wanted to take this time to make it easier to navigate for city staff and for the residents of Issaquah. We need to update code references. We'd also like to add hyperlinks so the code that we are referencing has a direct link so you can easily just click and vice versa. And then we've also need consistency with adopted plans. The comprehensive plan has been amended in 2018. 2018 also the parks had their strategic plan, and as I've discussed before, the 2013 Central Issaquah plan that has been recently amended in 2019. Periodic update will not reevaluate the ecological baseline. So back at the comprehensive update in 2013, there was an ecological baseline that was established. We are not going to reassess that or reevaluate that. And outside of our proposed amendments, we are not going to assess the no net loss of those baseline conditions. And then we're not going to change shoreline jurisdiction or any of the shoreline environmental designations.
Doug, is it a good time to interrupt you for just a second?
Sure.
Can you back up for just a moment? And, nope, the slide ahead of that one. Oh, and there. So when you say reevaluate the ecological baseline and assess, can you dig into what those might mean? A little bit more detail?
We're not doing that.
Right. The reason why I'm asking is so we don't ask questions that might be directed towards those.
Oh.
Like, what does it mean to when we say we're not going to reevaluate the ecological baseline? What is that? What is the baseline?
So in 2013, the conditions of all of the shorelines in Issaquah were evaluated, and in that evaluation established that this is the current condition of the shoreline, and we can't degrade that any further. That's what like the no net loss is. So we can only improve upon that. So in that time, whether it's individual residents or parks, they've gone about doing some shoreline restoration work, so making that better. But what we aren't going to do is to look at any of that. We're keeping with the original baseline and our original plans. The only thing that we'll be looking at is if we have, like our proposed amendments, we will look at to see if there would be any degradation to the shoreline.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. This is for tonight. I'm sorry about having it split up into two, but today we're going to be focusing on policies, and I also have a slide for the amendments to give you kind of a heads up of what we're looking at. But so even though the Shoreline Master Program and the Comprehensive Plan are separate documents, the goals and policies that are in the Shoreline Master Program are actually part of the Comprehensive Plan. And in our update, there's going to be some changes to those goals and policies. So 3.3.1, the recreational elements, we're reworking that so it's more in line with the city's vision for recreational use of the shoreline. In 5.10.1.9, we're removing that because it has to be done anyway. So we're kind of eliminating the need for a policy when something actually has to happen. And the same thing for 5.11.1.4. It says for encouraging low impact development, a lot of that is required with our stormwater code. So, and then again, consistency with adopted plans. So there are some policies in there that we need to update to reference, like Park Strategic Plan, for instance, the Green Necklace Plan, which is also part of parks, and then Lake Sammamish State Park. And again, and you'll probably see this a few more times, consistency with our zoning code. Replacing obsolete zoning code language, creating hyperlinks, just trying to make navigating this document a lot easier. And then here's a slide on SMP amendments, and next time we will be discussing this much further. So some of the amendments are state mandated. So the cost threshold for certain permit activities has gone up, and that's based on a schedule, the Office of Financial Management. State has also allowed for some certain exemptions for ADA retrofit of existing shoreline facilities. We're taking this time to update definitions to be consistent with state and city regulations, and also we've found some acronyms kind of thrown about the document that need some definition to them because they're just kind of sitting there. Cross-referencing with state and local regulations, again, creating those hyperlinks, utilizing them to make this process a lot easier, and then updating the obsolete and incorrect code citations. So here is our timeline. We are looking to submit to Ecology in September. The bulk of our work is being done now and should be done by the end of June. After that, it's just going to be going through the adoption process. On March 26th, we had a public meeting at the River and Streams Board where we kind of did a kickoff with that. And then right now we are holding our public hearing, which will then be carried over until June 13th. So, and with that, questions?
Yeah, I have various questions. They're of a rather detailed nature, and I'm not sure, given what you, the high-level presentation you just gave, how to ask you these questions. So are you going to now go through, or are one of you going to go through the document and the pages so that I'll just ask when you get to a page, or how is this going to work?
If you have any specific questions on one of the goals or policies that we've highlighted to change, feel free to just ask.
So, Ron, do you have a particular way that you would like the meeting to run tonight?
So, thought is that when we get to the various topics, that would be a good time to bring some of these questions up, and if we miss, or if we skip one of the topics, or we skip the question, then, sorry, if we skip over an area that you have a question on, it might be a good idea to bring the question forward and find out from the speakers whether or not it's a good time to answer that, or if we need to table it for another period. Does that work?
Right, because I think we were intending tonight that the 7 goals and policies that we listed in your memo, that would be the focus of the discussion. And then next time would be any of the code changes. That would be the focus of that meeting. And so do they fall into those categories?
More, I think more code change as opposed to high-level policy. So I guess it would be more next session.
Okay, because we'll also have the consultant, we'll have Watershed with us next time that would be able to answer, if there are any, super technical questions on why this or why that.
That's the June 13th meeting, or?
Correct.
Which one?
That you're not going to be, if you could send your questions, though, we could try to address them, so at least you'd have them with you for your knowledge. Does that work?
We can talk about them tonight if everyone's ready to,
Okay.
even, and then we can just follow up tomorrow, the next meeting, if that's okay.
Okay, that works for me. I just
All right.
didn't know without Watershed how we would feel about
Yes,
that.
well-
Because we have a lot of
Fine.
new people here, whenever you have a lot of questions, it's always best to send them in advance. Then the staff have a chance to be able to answer that and then put it in record also.
Right.
Share it with some of the other
And
commissioners.
Lucy had a good idea, too, that since you won't be here next time, you can ask, and we'll see how we do without Watershed to see how far we can get in answering and then following up the things that we can't.
Okay, so
that work?
let's just, yes, absolutely. So I'm just going to clarify because we've
Sure,
gone
sure.
a couple of different places. So technically, we're focusing on the policies tonight, but if the commissioners are ready, we are happy to hear your questions or comments. Without our resource, Watershed Company, who's our technical experts, we may not be able to answer all the questions, but it's very helpful for us to go ahead and ask them tonight, and then we'll just note where they are if we're not able to respond to them, and have them prepared to respond to it next time.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, just so we have a kind of an understanding, a collaborative decision here between the speaker and the staff and us. We're going to focus on the policies first, and if we can hold off on the code questions until...
We're saying we can continue with the code questions tonight, if that's all right with you.
At the same time we're going through policy, or after we're done with policy?
I would say after we're done with policy. I
Okay.
think that was a good idea.
Yeah, so we'll stick with the 7 policies first, and then after that, we'll see what we have as far as time-wise, and then we can ask some code questions that we have, and then see where we go with that.
Keeping in mind the subject matter expert will not be until next session, so we
Right.
may not get as many answers as we'd like. We dive too deep.
Right. But it is always helpful, I mean, these, Randy will tell you that often that's what we do at the Development Commission, so that it lets us be more prepared to really focus in on the things that you're concerned about, because we know what they are ahead of time.
Yep.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
Excellent. All right, it is all yours.
Right. So in your packet, the memorandum, we have identified 1 goal and 6 policies that we are changing, altering, or updating in some way. And that starts at page 28 of the Shoreline Master Program.
Which is page 58
58?
of the
Okay.
packet, I think.
Okay.
Love the page numbers.
Our page numbers match what you have on the screen, but may not be the same as what you're referring to.
3.3.1 is on 58.
Am I correct? So, just so you understand, Doug was referring to this page number that's in the middle, but for the total packet, it's in the lower right-hand corner.
Okay.
Okay? And that's always confusing, which set of page numbers we're referring to.
What's that, page 58, is that right?
We're at 58 of the packet, page 28 of the
SMP.
The
document.
document. So the original language was foster and support the stewardship of historical, cultural, and natural resources throughout the community in the form of parks, open space, and recreational system that serves the needs of the residents of the city of Issaquah and surrounding areas. And we've revised that, and you can see the underlined portion is what we intend on putting into the document.
And was this sort of generated by the Parks Department, for instance? Was that the genesis, or was this a DOE? Do you remember that at that level?
I believe this was city that initiated this.
One of my questions then is to follow on that. Why did you insert the words parks and recreation vision? I realize that sounds picky, but why focus on parks? Why focus on parks and recreation? That's it's their ownership then. Their vision may or may not in the future comport with this. So why?
Are you saying, Robin, that instead of the city's vision? Or are you saying?
Why label it's the vision? It's the vision. I'm asking.
Okay, I just wanted to be sure I understood the question.
My experience, just when you start labeling visions with some owner, and that owner changes, then it leads to unnecessary confusion potentially going forward. So it's just a question.
Okay.
And a suggestion, I guess, to eliminate parks and recreation, but nonetheless.
Right, and just make it vision.
Yes.
Okay.
That's my,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
question and suggestion.
Okay.
Actually, so question with that, we want an owner.
Do we want to what?
We want someone to be driving this, because if we remove Parks and Recreation,
Then it's the whole city, because it's the city's shoreline master program.
yeah,
This is also in the recreational element of the Shoreline Master Program, so probably the reason why that was kept in there, but I see your point. It's not only just parks that is driving recreation in the city. It should be the residents and,
Exactly.
included in that as well.
Well, and to Robin's point, I mean, once we have adopted the park strategic plan, even if the Parks Department was the leaders of that effort, it becomes the city's parks plan. And the same thing when Trish leads us through the comprehensive plan update, it's not long-range planning's comp plan, it is the city's comprehensive plan. So
Exactly.
I take the point.
I have a question for staff. In the definition, it says a vibrant parks trail system. As far as trail system, are these to be interconnected? What's the vision that the city has? I mean, are these to be interconnected? Are these trail systems that are alone in, or are these like completely connected throughout the city? Is that the goal? Is that the
Well,
vision?
that would be part of the park strategic plan that we looked at last year, remember? And that you worked with the Parks Department and the Park Board on the Green Necklace part of it that has all the new proposed ones that we would build in the future and the ones that are existing today. So I think this is taken from that so that it's consistent with Shoreline Master Program, that we say it in both places so that anything that happens the same way.
Okay.
Well, and I think I might add that, remember that this is a vision, so we aren't there today. So I think your point about is it interconnected or is it individual parks, it may be both right now. I think that the park strategic plan lays out sort of the thing that we're moving towards, which we aren't yet, we haven't yet
2019.
achieved. Yeah, yeah.
Do I have any more questions for?
Okay.
So the next policy in the memo is on page 55 and 56 of the plan, which is pages
85 and 86.
There.
Packet. These have to deal with water quality. You can see we're in the first policy, we're just updating for the correct zoning code, or yeah, the correct code in the IMC. And then for 2, removing and incentives provided. Every development within the city has to look at low-impact development techniques. It's what has to be done so we can increase on-site infiltration, clean stormwater prior to it being going into our waterways. So
because it's already part of a regulation, there's no need to have incentives.
yeah, we don't have
Made no
any
sense.
incentives.
So that's why it was struck down.
Yep.
As far as erosion control, that looks like we struck out 2 of those, 1 and 4, and again, at 1 and 2. What was the reasoning for removing those protections?
We're not removing the protections. They're required for all development, that they need to have temporary erosion and sediment control plan with the development. So instead of it being should be required, it is required based on the clearing and grading code in section 16. the
Got it,
IMC.
okay. And in the second section, then, it's already included in?
So things that are crossed out are being removed, things
Yeah, I
that are,
understand
okay, underlined are being added. And so instead of saying should be required, the specific provision requiring that is now there.
Right.
So it's like a redundancy. There's just no reason for it.
So we're considering clearing, grading, and stormwater management synonymous with erosion and sediment control? Okay.
Got it.
And actually, I'd like to bring some context to some of our newer commissions here. In the Central Issaquah plan, we used to promote language like should be required. And what happened was developers did everything opposite. So I'm glad to see is required instead of should be required. So, but in case you have a question, you always want to make sure it's strong enough to be able to hold up and on its own, because if we say it recommended, it will never get done.
Come on.
And just for my own edification, so erosion and sediment control, can that also be managed by planting vegetation for projects? Or is it literally just clearing and grading? Are there other ways to?
Post-development, yes, that is a technique that you can use. This is more dealing with the direct effects of development as it's occurring, so
Okay.
as the construction is happening.
I see, okay, all right, thank you.
So can I continue with that question about should be then, and perhaps you're ready, going back to page 85. Stormwater should be managed, low-impact development should be implemented, along with, to Ron's point, and to I think yours, why are we leaving the words, or why are you leaving the words should be in there? Have we already asked that question? I wasn't sure. Yeah.
And that's a good point. We are removing it in 4 and not, and keeping it in 2, so.
Yeah, and that is something that is a very frequent source of extended discussion when an applicant gets to the Development Commission as to that very open area of seeming to make it an option.
Yeah.
Should. And so anything that we can do to give the applicant and the city and the public a clearer understanding of what is required, I think, better the process.
So I would add in
And I'm not
this,
saying it should never say should, but I think that we should, I personally believe that it should be as infrequent as possible.
Tighter language.
There is a definition of should in the SMP that's a little bit more robust than
good point.
what would be typically found in say, like the central plan or in any plan. So should is almost a shall, unless you can demonstrate that you can't meet it for some particular reason. And I can pull that definition up so you can see what it looks like.
So if you look on page 54 of your packet, I actually like this so much I want to start pulling it into other documents that we use, because I think this is a nice definition of should, which is different than a definition.
54 of the.
Definition.
Where are you seeing?
On page 54 of your packet, page 24 of the program, definition number 99 is the definition of should that Doug was referencing.
As it relates to the SMP.
Yes.
Oh, it's required. It's 54.
Yeah, I was going to make a suggestion that maybe we look at the document itself and have the city come up with appropriate language to replace should, but that kind of does it.
Like I said, I really like it, and I'm thinking about using it elsewhere. The other thing I would add about the one that you were discussing on page 55 of the program, 85 of the packet, about low-impact development, I think that should is actually the correct word, and this is the reason why, is that, for instance, on the valley floor, there's such a high water table that we are not actually able to infiltrate in many places, whereas up on the hillsides where there's much more soil and the water table is much lower, that's where infiltration is appropriate. Since our shoreline zones often have high water tables and we have this aquifer protection, and if you have anything that's pollution generating, you may not actually want to infiltrate. So it is something that we think should be considered, but it is not always appropriate to require it. So I think that definition of should actually allows us that kind of opportunity to reflect and to make that evaluation to determine if this is a good location or not.
Okay, so quick recap here. Are you referring to 551, number 2, number 3?
I was referring to number 2, where I understood there to be some discussion of the word should relative to low-impact development.
Okay. So, commissioners, feedback? What do you think about leaving hearing Lucy's argument, leaving the word should be implemented now that we understand the definition as it is defined on page
Well,
25?
I refer to number 1. It seems to me there should be no looseness in that. I mean, stormwater is consistent with the stormwater management policy, is it not? I mean, there's no question about should there. Is it not that must be the case? Question. As opposed to should be the case, with the definition being on page 54.
Yes. Yeah.
So with number 1, I would suggest that we stick to our question about should appropriate there in the context of the definition just in the package, and perhaps number 2 and 3, given what was just said, we need discretion, but I don't understand number 1.
So your suggestion for number 1 is stormwater will be managed consistent with the city's stormwater management policy.
I would assume that would be the case.
And then number 2 and number 3, we will leave should be implemented and should be required.
That's my suggestion.
Okay. Any questions, brother? All right. Excellent.
And on the following page, 5.6, critical areas, environmental protection, and shoreline buffers. This was removed just because it has to. It has to comply with the Shoreline Master Program. It has to comply with our critical areas regulations. It seemed redundant to have this, that it has to provide a level of protection equal to or greater, when that's the purpose and of all of these environmental regulations.
Okay.
Then on page 95 of your packet, 65 of the SMP, it's 5.11 for parking. The city should encourage, number 4 has been struck out, and I think Lucy alluded to this not too long ago, but this is kind of a little bit more specifics with it, is that pollution generating sources, because of the high water table, pollution generating sources aren't able to use techniques such as permeable pavements, and this came from our stormwater engineer's review of this section. So, and she was describing that since they're pollution generating sources, the ability to infiltrate using these techniques with a high water table isn't a good practice.
But this change will affect, it'll be policy for all of Issaquah, even areas not impacted by a high water table, right? So if we remove this, do we run the risk of not having those policies in place where we actually need them?
No, because this is just within the shoreline. This document is just for within the shoreline jurisdiction. So you're outside, and it's different standards that would be applying, that you wouldn't be regulated under this document.
So to Trish's point, while there is overlap between the SMP and the comp plan, this particular phrase, just because it's struck down, doesn't necessarily mean that you're striking it down in a comp plan. Okay.
Correct.
Or in other, or even regulations in other parts of the city, not just the comp plan, but also the specific standards that
Municipal
apply.
code.
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe the next one's page 122 of the packet, page 92 of the program.
So in this policy, this is the 6.2, public recreational use and development. And with this policy change, this is just incorporating recently adopted plans since the comprehensive update in 2013. So just including the park strategic plan, the corridor and green necklace plan, streams and riparian restoration plan, and the Lake Sammamish State Park wetland stream and lakeshore restoration plan. So this is just getting the correct documents into the policies to be implemented.
Okay. Appropriate cataloging.
And then we're on page 133 of the packet
There's so many plans.
and page 103 of the program.
I have a quick question. I see it throughout this half, 6.22, where we scratched out launches and put in ramps. Is there any, what's the reason behind that? Is there a definition difference between?
Yeah, we had done something with the
Ramp seems like.
definition with that, kind of combining them into one. I'm
So
trying to recall this from a couple months ago when we had discussed this.
was this the launches and rails?
Launches versus rails, and I'll have to go back and look at that, but there was a reason why we did that, and it was like, we had all of these different phrases for essentially saying the same thing without really any context to it, so.
But it doesn't change a person's ability to launch. I mean, we're not talking about launching one type of boat versus another type of boat. This is just policy language? Okay.
Ramps actually seems like a better definition. Seems broader.
It does.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes the details in the
Devil's in the
and
details.
it's like, why would we change that word? You know, make the effort to do something.
So this is 7.3, and again, this policy change for number 2, it's just changing it to be exactly like the previous one you looked at. So, and then underneath that for number 7, we've added wayfinding signage as well into the public recreation use. And
As far as the wayfinding signage, is there a stipulation that it would, I mean, I would imagine it would, but that it would be similar or identical to trailheads that already exist?
I'm not exactly sure what the wayfinding signage would look like, and with this, a lot of this would be driven by Parks incorporation of their plans, so.
Okay.
I could add something to that.
Okay.
Actually, I believe this year the city is launching, with Parks as one of the lead departments, a wayfinding and branding program to try and rethink how we do all the signs,
Great.
but do it comprehensively. So it's not just for parks, not just for trails, not just for businesses, but to try and think about how we do all of that to make it easier for people to recognize it, know what they're looking for, understand how to get around. So it just began. I think we just hired the consultant, so we have no idea, as Doug said, what it's going to look like. But that is an effort that's underway now.
So the goal is uniformity, and obviously aesthetically pleasing, but the idea is, you know, Issaquah Highlands wouldn't look different, their trails wouldn't look different than the urban area, because like you said, then people could point out, they'd recognize it very clearly. This is a...
So I'm going to just cover myself a little bit. It may not be uniformity. They may decide that they want business ones to be different than trail ones, just to be recognizable. And even once that program is adopted, it will take time to be implemented. They probably won't go take out all the signs at once, but at some point, as Issaquah Highlands, for instance, because they have a lot, you're right, a lot that's already signed, that we will incorporate that as things get replaced and work with the homeowners association to integrate that in as they're replacing things along the way.
Could I ask what the word encourage means? When I hear words like that, I think this is a document that's supposed to drive action. I don't know what the word encourage mean, and is it the intent here to increase trail usability or to increase people's use of the trails? There's two different things going on. Usability is, are they developed? Use of the trails is, do I go and walk on them? So I'm confused by what encourage is, and I'm not sure what usability means here.
I would say it's starting with usability. It would be kind of all of the above. I mean, have these trails clearly identified to be able to get from A to B, but also encourage its ease of use so you know where you're going. As for encouraged, I agree with you. Like, that seems kind of, I don't want to say wishy-washy, but it's not as firm as it could be. And
Yeah, so if this is a policy document, then I'm just making a suggestion that we want words that drive a policy action. And encourage, to me, I don't know what it means. So I'll just put it out as a suggestion that that word be reviewed. If you're looking to drive action, then encourage doesn't tell me what to do.
Point.
I have a wordsmithing idea. I want to pass it by you all. Wayfinding signage will be implemented where possible to improve navigation.
I can go with that.
Thoughts? That was a discussion point, not to say, hey, this is it, but what are your ideas?
I think that navigation seems a little narrow. I mean, I consider usability to be, am I going the right direction? How far do I have until the point where I want to stop and turn around, or, not necessarily am I lost or not. I like the word navigation, but I think it's a little narrow. I like usability. Maybe a combination of both.
I kind of like both Bill and Ron's suggestions. So like the first part, wayfinding signage will be, and then where possible to increase trail usability.
What if we just simplified the language and said provide wayfinding signage where possible to increase trail, whichever word you all think is a better, usability and navigation, usability, I leave that up to your discretion.
Navigation and usability.
I have just a general question. As the only person probably in the city of Issaquah who doesn't have a smartphone, my understanding is that everybody can look at their phone and tell where they are. So I absolutely support wayfinding signs, but I'm wondering about how many people that I see walking everywhere doing this are going to actually be influenced by a physical sign.
I can tell you from my experience, and so I understand where you're coming from. When I go out for trail runs, I never take my phone with me. It's heavy, it bumps around. Sometimes I may not even have a cell signal. So there's many times where, I go up, up around Squawk or up around Cougar, where that trail system, literally almost every 50 or 100 feet, sometimes it'll change from one trail to another. And so I could travel a matter of 2 miles and be on up to like 10 trails along that 2-mile route. And so for me, the signs are really useful. I love my smartphone, but I rarely take it when I'm out. For me, it's about getting back to nature and getting away from the phone.
I think to another point, I grew up near Stossel Creek, so there's not always signals out there in certain trailheads. And it's almost kind of like a lot of people use email, but when it comes to law, you still have to provide certain documents by USPS, snail mail. So I kind of agree with Bill. You can't assume that everyone's going to use a smartphone. You can't assume that there's going to be signals. So, and again, some people, for other reasons, wouldn't have one anyway. I still think the signage is important.
And not just for wayfinding, but for sustainability of the trails too, keeping people from cutting switchbacks, hopping off the boardwalk at Lake Sammamish State Park.
That's a good point.
Are these, is there any consideration, the comprehensive plan, or strategic plan, has multiple references to the diversity, the increasing diversity of the city's population? Are any of these signs going to be in more than English?
I wouldn't be able to answer that.
That's a great question, Randy.
I see people all the
Yeah.
time on my trail system up on Squawk that, first place, they're doing this, and I don't know what, if they're trying to find out where they are, but many of them that I've encountered don't speak English all that well.
So I will pass that question along to the group that's working on the wayfinding signs. I think that's very interesting point, very appropriate because we're seeing a big bump in the census of people who.
Well, we also have the county or the city that's busing people out here now
Yes.
from
Well,
Seattle
it's right.
to hike. And
Bus to
and-
Trails or whatever
yeah.
it's called.
And that's, my understanding, it's an extremely successful program that they're amping up the number and frequency. And those are, people who probably would benefit from having some language other than English on the signs. If we're going to go into that, it's a pretty comprehensive effort.
Yeah, I would agree.
If you're going to put signs everywhere there's a divergence of a trail, that's a big deal. But, and I know this is a work in progress and always will be, but, if we already have a significant immigrant population, people that are moving here for whatever purpose and don't speak English that well and want to avail themselves of the system, and we want them to do that. It's just an idea.
I think there's another element. Visit Issaquah DMO is also bringing tourism. So we have people staying in the hotels, and they don't always speak English. So
Yeah.
we may want to incorporate, well, I know Jennifer Fink is on the board, and she's working with that, but that's a good idea that we may not have thought of before.
Yeah.
So just a
Language.
suggestion for you, Lucy. If you look, Israel has signs everywhere that are in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, and they do a pretty nice job, and that's all over the country. So if you were looking for signs that have multiple languages, you could look probably there.
That's a great idea. Thank you. The other one I would just add is that this not necessarily shoreline related, but the other thing is not all trail users are walking. If you're bicycling, you don't necessarily want to try and be juggling. I'm sure there's some kind of a device where you can load your phone onto it, but I would say that you don't necessarily want bicyclists to be having to pull out their phone and trying to navigate at the same time. So there are obviously many, many reasons that we want multiple techniques for helping people navigate. So, great.
I think the summary on this is number 7 was added as, maybe not an afterthought, but it was not included before. It's a very important, at the time we talked about it, this is an important discussion. So I hope, I don't know what happens from here, but
I've made a note for myself to talk with Jen Finks from Parks regarding that and see, and at least just let her know that this was something that was being thought about, and then this can be brought up with their consultant team and everyone else who's working on their sign plan.
Yeah, this is a great endeavor. This is much needed.
I think that's it for the goals and policies. So if you have any other questions with the development regulations, I will try to answer them, or if anybody else has, I don't know.
So that is a question. Would you want to take public comment before we switch from policies to standards, or?
Yes, yeah, let's go ahead and take public comment. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for public comment. We have 2 people from the public. I don't know if you are here to speak or not, but if you would like to, the mic is yours. You just have to tell us your name and where you live. Or not. I'm not calling you out. See if Very good. I can see they're starting to sweat. All right, so we'll go ahead and no public comment. So we'll go ahead and not close the public comment. We'll keep it open until June 13th. So to come back to my commissioners, before we move topics, I just want to recap, make sure we have everything vetted out. Policy 5.1, we talked about the word should be. And Lucy gave us the definition in the packet. And so the idea was to, let's see, hang on, 55, let's go back to 55. We are going to, or we're asking the city for stormwater will be managed consistent with city stormwater management policy, and bullet number 2 and number 3, we're okay with leaving it as should be implemented. Correct? Okay, no questions or anything like that? All right, good. And then number 7.31, we just talked about that, and Lucy and the team will come back and we'll come back with some suggested wording for our next meeting. Correct? Good? All right. We're ready to move on.
Okay. Since I don't know where any of you are in reading the whole document, if anybody has anything specific, I would just say, just tell me the page number of the packet, and then I can get to that so I can see, so I can answer the specific question if I can. It may have to defer the answering until we have watershed here, so just make a note of that question and then come back to us on the 13th.
A quick question is,
Yes.
would it be good, Doug, to send it to you or to Lucy if we have questions after we continue to go through the
You can
packet?
send them to me, and I have my business cards up here.
Perfect.
I can hand them out to you.
Great.
That'd be great.
The other thing is, if you look on the first page of the packet where you see inquiries, and it has Trish H., you can also just
Send
do...
them to me, too.
That, or you can do Doug Y. at exactly the same address.
Oh, and because we haven't actually completed our training, we can't have a discussion through email, so you can only field questions to the staff, and the staff can respond back, but we can't engage each other through email discussion.
Okay, thank you.
And we'll go through that training next week.
Good to know.
Good point.
I think it was Robin who had a question on regulations to start with. So-
Yeah, I guess there are various questions, but let me just, if you go to page 17 of 149, it's also called page 4, I don't know how you want to, so,
Oh, the checklist.
so my question to you is, there are modifications, these tables, the buffers, there's some modifications. If you look at the various classifications, there are actually changes to the buffers. So what happens, a landowner that owns a piece of property, thinks they know what they can do with it, and now there's a change to a buffer, and I know from personal experience what that can mean to a development. Okay, so so there's some very clear language later on that says that this code and the actions undertaken cannot, I'm paraphrasing, not negatively affect, it's the taking, can. So what happens with these where there are buffer changes and you got a piece of property and it diminishes the value of that property for some reason? Is that all clear? I mean, it concerns me throughout this. There are changes that I'd say, wow, that could really, if I owned a piece of property affected by this, then that could be a negative impact, and I might be hurt by this. And what happens?
There are permit mechanisms to allow that when something like that changes, if buffers increase and now you don't have an ability to develop that property, that there are variance processes you can go through. In shoreline jurisdiction, that would be a shoreline variance. With this, we aren't proposing changing any of the buffers. So the buffers from Issaquah Creek will still be 100 feet. The buffers from Lake Sammamish are 35 feet. Now, where there may be some changes with wetlands, and this is something that we are discussing internally, it actually is decreasing some of them, not increasing. And that is just on certain wetlands with a certain habitat score. But we aren't necessarily looking, I guess I should say, we're looking at whether or not we're going to adopt those standards or keep with our current standards.
Because it was that, in fact, that I was referring to, and I thought they increased the buffers, actually. If I look at those two tables, then there's actually, and I don't want to get into the details, I just want to know that right now, when I read that, I think there's a question. It leads to a question. I read a buffer increase, I see potential damage to a landowner or a property owner's well-being. What happens? You're saying that you're discussing that now. There's internal discussion.
Yeah, whether we're going to include the new wetland standards, the buffer standards, that's being discussed.
Thank you.
In terms of if you increase anything, that, like I said, there are mechanisms in place that would allow you through like a variance process to develop the land. Now, that you may not be able to get fully what you have envisioned for your property. It would be essentially reasonable use, and that would be determined. Yes.
Rookie question here. On this issue, what does the state and the county jurisdiction come into with regard to buffers? So I would assume that the city of Issaquah cannot allow anything in terms of buffer definition changes that conflict with the King County definitions and/or the state definitions. Is that correct?
The county, not so much, the state, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit with at least I don't know if you're familiar with the wetland guidance.
So, I'm sorry, Maria, you'll have to come speak at the microphone.
Yeah, the Department of Ecology reviews the best available science, and we publish guidance documents on what we, through that review of the best available science, what we believe will be buffers that would protect the values and functions of wetlands. And then cities, and so we publish that for cities to look to for when they're developing their buffers. For shoreline buffers, that there's not specific numbers that we publish as guidance. That's more specific to from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In terms of permitting, the state has a permitting role for, Doug was just talking about shoreline variances. So if someone is needing to reduce the buffer to get reasonable use of their property, that permit would also come to the state for our review and approval in addition to city approval. And as you said, that King County would be separate jurisdiction, so that wouldn't really be involved. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think you need to identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Maria Sanderco with the Department of Ecology.
Yes, thank you, it does.
Be on the spot.
No, it's fine. That's what I'm here for.
Could I follow up with another question in that area? Referring to page 24 of 149, it's also called page 11. The statement says, in order to utilize these updated wetland buffers, the ones we're just talking about, applicants are required to implement wetland minimization measures. See table 3.4. So I looked at table 3.4, and I could well imagine certain situations where the property owner cannot follow the prescribed mitigations. What happens then?
That's what we're trying to find out exactly. If you couldn't do it, then what does that mean? And that's why we're having the internal discussion. We've been speaking with someone from Department of Ecology as well to try to get guidance on what this means for the residents of the city if we were to implement this.
So what you're saying is this isn't baked yet. The city is in a go-between.
We have two choices, and we're still weighing which choice is most appropriate for the city.
Which then means theoretically, we would be back to reevaluate this document again before the 8 years because this language may change.
So the critical area, so I'm looking at Doug because I want to make sure I don't get out over my skis. The wetland buffers, there's obviously an integral relationship between the shoreline regulations and the wetland regulations, but they're in two separate documents, and they rely on each other. So we are in the process of updating Title 18, which is the land use section of the municipal code, and that's where the critical area regulations are. So this, the Shoreline Master Program will reference the municipal code, so we could pick a different set of buffers than are there now, consistent with state guidance, and not have to come back and change the Shoreline Master Program, because this is about the shorelines, the critical area regulations are about the wetlands, and they're cross-referencing each other.
Okay, so if this is referencing, say, policy A in the critical wetlands policy, then we could change that policy and would not impact this document.
Yes, although we really only have two choices, because the state establishes our choices for wetland buffers. So there was one set of wetland buffers, those are the ones we have now. There's another set of guidance, as Maria described it. We're just trying to understand the implications of those changes to make sure that they are a good choice for the city, or we could stay where we are.
Okay. So we're not, once we approve this, this is it. It almost seems like we should be looking at both at the same time. I mean, in the best world, right?
I'm not sure, because the wetland buffers don't just apply in shoreline circumstances, they apply throughout. It's the same buffers for any wetland in the city.
Right.
And so we wouldn't have one for the wetlands associated with shorelines and a different one for other areas.
But if we decide we want to change the language in that policy, and it's in conflict with the policy we're just approving now,
It won't be in conflict.
it wouldn't be in conflict? Okay.
And if I'm reading this right, the SMP from 2013, there's no strike-throughs, there's no additions, so there's no proposed changes even to the wetland section of the buffer zone, right? There was discussion, I think you mentioned that there was a possibility of maybe shrinking those, but in this document, there's no edits that we're proposing any changes.
Yeah, we're not proposing anything at this time. And that's something, like I said, that's something that we're discussing.
And this has to be finalized before, is it the state reviews? And that's by the end of this year.
So do you want to keep going through standards? I mean, do you want to start with, I think the document starts on, page 36 of the packet, and we can just move through and answer any questions that come up.
All right, so I guess let me ask the commissioners, does anybody have, I know, Robin, you've got some questions here. I don't know if we've already addressed them all. Do we have questions already identified in the packet that we want to draw attention to? And then we can maybe figure out, use some sort of order.
I have a couple more questions, but they are to do with the pages starting from
Okay.
page
Does
whatever. it is.
anybody else have any questions about the codes that are in here now, or?
Not at the moment.
Not the moment, I'll probably use next meeting for some more.
Okay, all right, so why don't we go ahead and, do we want to just skip right to Robin's questions?
There's just a couple here, and they're short. So
Lucy?
Sure,
Okay, go ahead, Robin. You have the
absolutely.
floor.
page 39 of 149, also called page number 9. Clause number 4, can you, this is a request for explanation. It says the regulatory provisions of this program are limited to shorelines of the state, and whereas the planning functions of this program may extend beyond the designated shoreline boundaries. Could you explain that second part of that, whereas the planning functions of this program may extend beyond? What are planning functions, and what does extend beyond mean?
So in an instance where the 200-foot shoreline jurisdiction from, say, Issaquah Creek it extends onto a particular piece of property, but not the whole thing. So the whole parcel, or part of the parcel is within shoreline jurisdiction, part of the parcel is not. The planning functions extend beyond that. So if your development activity is outside of that 200 feet, then you're not subject to this, and it would just be planning functions.
What does planning functions mean then? Is that part of the land, just regular land
Their
use?
land use planning, yes.
Okay. But it says is whereas the planning functions may extend beyond. I read that to say just exactly the reverse of what you said. That in fact, if a piece of property is partially within the 200-foot boundary, then the controls, the regs that pertain to the 200 feet, the shoreline master plan, would extend to the whole property. That's why I asked this question. You're saying no, it's exactly the reverse of that. Really?
So if your development activity doesn't touch the shoreline jurisdiction. You're not subject to the shoreline regulations.
All right? Am I the only one that reads that to be exactly the reverse of what you just said? But I guess I am. Next one, page 41, also number 11. It's again a question for clarification. It's clause number 4. It's classification of a use or development. What was scratched out was as permitted does not necessarily mean that the development is allowed. And then wording is introduced is subject to review and approval by the city and or the Department of Ecology. I read that and I'm still unclear. If there is, you're planning a single family residence within the, it's a permitted use as I read it. But it may be that it's not, or yes, it is a permitted use, but we may attach conditions. I'm still not clear to two very different things here, and you've changed the wording significantly to affect that.
I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but there would be scenarios where something may be allowed in the underlying zoning of that particular piece of property, but that use is not allowed within shoreline jurisdiction.
Like a dry cleaner? Something like that that would affect?
It could be something like that. I had something specific that I brought up with you in a meeting once, and now I
Well,
can't
this
think
was
of it.
partly my edit, because to me, having something permitted and being allowed or allowed and not permitted, I found that language very confusing because kind of to Robin's point, a lot of these are single-family homes, along the shoreline. And so if you're a single-family homeowner and you're trying to figure out what you can and can't do, it'd be nice to be able to look at a document and have some sense of what you can do. And so I think that's the things that are struck in number 4 was just that I personally found that not very clear. Although once Doug into it for me, I understood it. I didn't think you should have to have a Doug by your side to be able to understand the language. And so I think they just tried to edit it down to its essentials, which is that a use or development is subject to review by either both and city and ecology, and that there may be conditions applied. So the permitted and allowed language was taken out just because I thought it was confusing to the average reader.
So let me ask a question regarding this. 900, there was a development for clustered housing, and it's very close to a protected wetland space, right? So it was permitted, but I don't think the city was wanted it. So this language would then allow the city to say, we understand it is allowed by the code, but it's not something that we want to see move forward because it's going to have an impact to the wetlands.
So this is only applicable to the shorelines. So unless a wetland is in the shoreline area, it wouldn't apply. And the
same principle?
Well, I want to be clear that just, and I'm not sure you're saying this, but just because we don't like something once it comes up, if it's not been adopted to reflect that, we can't change the rules. So we have to be thoughtful ahead of time about the implications of having certain uses in certain locations. I believe that the uses are relying on the underlying zoning unless there's a specific conflict with a provision here. And I'm going to hand it over to you because I don't want to get myself in trouble.
I would say that's largely the case. And this was a lot of this work went in the 2013 comprehensive update and analyzing what are some of the uses, or what are the uses that are in the shoreline, what's compatible. You still end up having some of these situations where a use may be
Incompatible.
incompatible, yes.
Okay,
thanks.
that's kind of where I was going, was we have, it's permitted, but it's not really compatible with fishing. Okay. So any other questions? Robin, we exhausted you?
No, I'm confused on the wording of the one, but, and thank you for the answers.
All right, so we're running down towards the end here. Are there any last questions that you have for Doug?
After this goes through ecology for their review, what's the next step of events? It goes through council at that point?
Yeah, I'll pull that up on here. So we are currently working together. This is our, we have a joint comment period.
Hey, Doug, would you go ahead and go into the mode just so the words are larger?
Oh, I've got to go back and do.
Actually, if you just click
Yeah,
on
just
that.
hit that, yeah.
There you go.
All right. So next steps after this, we will hold our next meeting towards the end of June. We will kind of be submitting everything for review to get get Ecology's initial determination, and then we should receive that by the end of July. Then we're going to start going through the council process, and I have right now listed on here that we would be going to council and then land and shore and back to council for adoption. This may change, and we may do the study session with council, but that part's to be determined, and that will happen towards the end of the summer.
I'm assuming any edits, by ecology, then we'd want it to go back through PPC again, in addition to land and shore, right, or no?
Not necessarily. I think what we're trying to get your guidance. If it went completely sideways, if there was a massive change, then I think we would be back with you.
Okay.
But if there is fine tuning consistent with the document that you've seen, we would not bring it back to you.
So the idea being today and the follow-up meeting on June 13th, that's the opportunity for PPC to put in their input. And again, as long as we're not changing the intent of the document, just fine-tuning, there would be no reason for it to come back. And it can continue its journey to ecology and where else.
And so, a lot of times, that's part of the reason that Ron's recapping. Sometimes you will give us guidance, this isn't clear, we want this idea incorporated, and we're not necessarily getting every single word set before it leaves here. We're being given, staff is being given guidance of the kinds of changes that are necessary to then send it on to the next stage. The other thing I would add for next meeting is, because we have a lot more pages we're going to be talking about next time. If you see typos, punctuation, grammatical, awkward phrases, let's not talk about those next time. Just make a list or mark it up and scan it and send it to us, or drop your copy off or hand it to us after the meeting. But let's not plan to do that. But where you have a technical question, where there's a bigger sort of policy question, those I think are super helpful to hear from you. But where it's just the fine-tune punctuation, grammar kinds of things, feel free to just hand those to us and we'll take care of those. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so any last questions for Maria or for Doug?
One last question, just to process. When there were some answers you've given where you've indicated you're still deliberating on certain issues, which could be substantive, given, do you take an inventory of properties where decisions, one way or the other, will impact those properties? And does that get incorporated into your decision-making? Or is that, too bad, whatever it is?
That's kind of what I'm trying to do now with the new wetlands, is part of it is connecting certain corridors and getting a list of what those corridors are, where they are located in the city, and which properties they affect. And that's a lot of the work that I'm doing behind for that portion.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I can tell you that the last time, I think maybe 4 meetings ago, we had an open hearing on the changes to single-family lot use. And for that to happen, if there is any impact at all to property owners, they had to mail out notices of the change in advance. That led to a very full house for public comments. So, yeah,
Well, and
definitely notifications do go out.
Yes, and thank you. That's a great point. And the other one I would add is that when we adopted the current wetland regulations, which we were required to adopt by the state, but we were kind of slow to adopt them because it was, because it's based on a habitat score, it's hard to predict. It wasn't, the way we used to do it is once a wetland was identified as a certain classification, boom, the buffer was X. And now it's a habitat score. And so that created not only more uncertainty for property owners, but more uncertainty for the city. We didn't know exactly what that was going to mean. So we actually waited a couple of years and asked property owners as they were coming in under the old system if they would also do the habitat score, since they were hiring a consultant, just to see what the impacts would be, because we are not qualified to do habitat scoring. So we were trying to get a sense. I think that is the challenge, Robin, is that if we go to another system, again, it's still reliant on a habitat score, so we don't necessarily know. I will add, though, that the range that triggers a certain buffer is shifting so that they're smaller, which is what Doug was saying. But that's why we're just taking it a little slowly. We want to think about what the implications of the change would be, so that to the best of our abilities, we are describing this well to the council and public in the process, so that they have some sense of what we think will happen.
I think it's probable, and I would turn over this to you, but it seems to me that with things like that massive study on the effect of runoff on municipal runoff on coho smelt, or coho young fish. Fry, smell, whatever. But that was so dramatic. I believe that the state is continuing at the state level to look at changes in regulations that will be effective for both shoreline and wetland areas going forward. So I think this is going to be something that is going to change every year. Just based on the discussion that's going on in Olympia and elsewhere, I would defer to.
Maria Sanderco with the Department of Ecology. Yeah, I think it's particularly relevant to our stormwater regulations and our stormwater manual that we published, which is a separate part of ecology from the shoreline division that I'm in, but it is all related to protecting the ecological function of our waterways. So, and I do, the cities and our manual updates every few years, and cities will update regarding, to be consistent with that.
And to build on what Maria is saying, the program called NPDS, really lyric, is changing every few years. We are required to update, and we are in the process of preparing for another update. And each of those, as we're heading in, I think, to our third round, is a more rigorous set of requirements, which is both wonderful and difficult, because we're having to add staff to, the reporting requirements are becoming more and more specific. More and more properties fall underneath those reporting regulations, and we have staff that go out and check waste enclosures and oil grease separators, and are doing a lot more inspections now, and working with property owners and businesses to ensure that that they're compliant, and if they're having challenges, to try and help provide them with the resources. So it is growing each year.
All right, so any questions from the staff to the commissioners? Or Doug or Maria, do you have any questions for this? Okay. All right, so quick recap. I think the only action items we're asking of the staff is to provide suggested wording for under policy 73.1, number 7, referring to the wayfinding signage. And then again, we were talking about policy 5.1.1. Question number 1 will be, and we are leaving bullets 2 and 3 as should be, as the document illustrates. And any other questions that you want to add to that, or instructions? No? Okay. In that case, I'm ready to adjourn the meeting. Okay, so we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting at 7:57.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks,
All right,
Doug.
thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.